I have a Petri 135mm f3.5 lens here that I'm going to be disassembling. I'm going to be fully disassembling this lens to get access to the diaphragm, body sections, and mechanical components almost all individually. I wasn't able to find out how to actually take apart the diaphragm fully, but you can get access to the diaphragm and clean it on its own. I just don't know how to actually fully take it apart. So we're going to start here on the front of the lens and get access to the front of the diaphragm. So looking here, we have the name ring up front, no divots or anything for a spanning wrench, but you can use a piece of pipe that just will fit around the exterior of this with something like gaffer's tape stuck to it to actually undo this by pressing on the name ring only. Alright, so there's the name ring. Now we have the front optic a little more exposed, and we also have this black ring now, which is what the filters would normally screw into, this large one, which is the next ring we'll remove. It just screws in place and was held down by the name ring. So unscrew this. There's that body section. Now we've exposed the top of the focusing mechanism here and the first, or the elements here, the first front optic piece. So looking at this front optic piece, we can see that there are two little divots on either side for a spanning wrench. So we can undo that. And this is just going to remove this black ring on the top. It's not actually going to remove the optics. So this black ring is just holding in place the first element. And then once we remove this first element, which is now exposed, there's a little lip you can kind of get a fingernail on and lift that off. Once you remove that first element, then this entire the rest of the elements all come out in one piece. So there's this next little black ring under it, which is just like a spacer. It lifts in place there, and then this big group of elements should fall out of place, right, like that. So I don't think you can really disassemble this piece, but it does allow you to clean inside if there was fungus under just the first element. You'd have to cement these back together or uncement them, so it'd be a lot more work to actually take this kind of thing apart. And now we have access to the front of the diaphragm blades here. Let me adjust this. So this particular copy doesn't have the diaphragm working at the moment, but you can see that the diaphragm would normally be down here, so it's a little bit far down inside the lens, but you can actually clean inside of here okay. And even once we get the diaphragm isolated on its own, it's still pretty far down inside the mechanism, so it's a little bit harder to clean than on a normal length lens. So now we'll just flip over the lens here and start getting access to the back of the diaphragm as well. You can see that there are there are actually three little screw looking things. Two of them are normal slotted screws on this mounting plate going around here. This third one though, over by the indicator that allows you to switch modes, is kind of odd. It's got a knob that's sticking up and then two little cutouts on either side. So you can't undo it with a normal screwdriver, but if you have a very tiny screwdriver, you can kind of get enough into the little notches on it to actually unscrew this. It just screws in place like a normal screw, but it's a little bit harder to work with. So this removes the mounting plate, the silver mount itself. And we've also now loosened up the other rings in here. There's nothing holding them on at this point. So we have this next ring right in here, which has some of the couplings of the stop-down lever, which we'll talk about later. And next up we have the ring in here as well, this silver one, which is the one that rotates back and forth to switch between the two modes. You can see it kind of clicks in when you go into one of them. So this also just lifts off, but there is a little ball bearing, or actually there is a screw holding it in over here, this black screw, and then there's also a little ball bearing underneath it on one side, so just be careful when taking this apart that you don't lose that little ball bearing. And then lift off this ring, and the little ball bearing is right here, so I'll get that out of there. Now we have the aperture control ring. So the aperture control ring is held in place by two things. It also has a little black screw over here that will undo. And then there's this little silver notch right here that is sticking out that we can also have to undo. So set those to aside. And then like the ring before, actually right under where that previous ball bearing was, over by the indicators here, there's another ball bearing. So just be careful when taking that off as well. And I'll just remove the ball bearing so we don't lose it. There are a few other little ball bearings embedded around here, but I don't think they can be removed as easily. It seems that you would have to remove them from the inside of the lens. They don't seem to come out normally here, and I think they just provide a smooth motion for the aperture control ring as it rotates about. So after removing all those different body sections, let me focus in, we actually do have access to the back of the element a little bit better here. And you don't need to remove all those body sections if you just want to get access to the back of the diaphragm. But since we loosened them up, I thought it'd be worthwhile just removing them as well. So here on the back element, we have this long tube here with the two little notches at the top for a spanning wrench. So there's that tube, and that's just holding on the front or the only back element, which you can lift out of position right there. So that can be cleaned on its own as well. Now we do have access to both sides of the diaphragm here. Let me actually stop this down manually. So we have access to the back of the diaphragm here. I'm just manually stopping it down since the coupling is not working out quite right in its current setup. And we can clean both sides of the diaphragm. As I mentioned, I don't know how to actually take the entire diaphragm apart, so this is probably a good point. If you just need to clean off the diaphragm, you can clean both sides fairly well. If you look in here, let me stop down the lens one more time. The front of the diaphragm is where the petals are kind of overlapping here. So that's the side that you can actually press a little bit more on, and then the back side you have to be careful or when pressing on it if you're cleaning it off with something like a Q-tip, because it does flex more down, whereas this side the little blades kind of press up against each other, so you can use a little bit more force on that side. Now we'll actually go and remove the rest of the body sections here and get the diaphragm on its own so that it could be submerged if it's really dirty and cleaned a little bit better. So next up we have the big focusing ring here on the outside of the lens. So this focusing ring is just held in place by three little screws down inside of it, going around here. And when you take off this ring, you may want to note or mark on here somewhere, focus it over to infinity or something, and just note that you had it focused to infinity, or mark where the screws were lining up. Once you do remove this ring, you should zero the lens back to infinity later, because the ring can be attached in a lot of different orientations, so you want to make sure that when you later reattach it, the ring properly indicates infinity focusing. So now we've exposed the focusing mechanism a little bit better here, and we still have one more body section, which is this one right here with the depth of field scale on it. So this ring is just attached by 5 little slotted screws going around. They're kind of recessed down. They were normally hidden by that focusing ring, so just going around there. You don't need to undo these all the way. You can just loosen them up, and then this piece will slide out of place. So I'm just going to loosen them up until they're kind of at the top. All right, and now this ring just slides right off, and we have it separate from the diaphragm and the main focusing mechanism here. So looking at this piece, the focusing mechanism and the diaphragm, these two are coupled together at the moment, so you can't clean them as well as you may like. So to actually take them apart, we're going to remove the focusing mechanism and the diaphragm from each other fully. So you'll notice that when I focus to one extreme, it kind of stops. You can't focus past a certain point on one side, and on the other side here, as I focus in, there's this little intersection here that's hitting up against this silver bar down here. So that's limiting the focus in the focusing in the other direction. And then we can also see that this other little fork in the back is also kind of sticking out over where the focusing mechanism needs to go. So what we're going to do is remove this fork on the back section first, then remove this little bar, and that will allow us to focus past where we could before and get the focusing mechanism mostly on its own. The diaphragm and focusing mechanism on this lens are a little bit more integrated than on some other ones, so it does make it a little bit harder to clean in my understanding of this lens. So first off, we have the back fork section here that we have to remove. So this is just held in place by this silver retaining ring first on the back here. So we'll remove this. So there's that ring, and then the fork itself should just lift right out of place. So there's that. Next up we have that little stopper, the metal stopper thing over on this side. It was preventing us from focusing out before, so we'll undo the two screws that are holding it in place. And just remove that little stopper entirely. Now we can focus backwards past where we could before. There's still this little lever here that you could remove. It has a little screw that you could actually loosen up, but that's not really necessary. It's in the way, so if you just hold it in place and then focus out past it, you can go past where it could before, lift off the back of the focusing mechanism, and get the two parts of the focusing mechanism separate. So looking here at this diaphragm assembly, this is actually the piece that I couldn't figure out how to take apart any further, but I will describe how it works, and you can clean it pretty well in its current state. So this has the diaphragm and the inner part of the focusing mechanism up here. And the diaphragm is operated, it looks like it has two sheets on the inside. So looking at the back section here, there are two sets of little levers. There's this one over here with a little spring, and both sides of it actually move, but they move independently. And then there's this other lever over here, which moves the black sheet, which is the one that this little, the top section of this little section over here is attached to. So these two are coupled together, and they're on the black sheet, and then there's the gray sheet on top, which is held open by the spring that's attached to the black sheet. So to actually get the diaphragm to show up here and be able to clean it off or something, you can hold the black, one of the black levers in place and then move the little gray lever back and forth to open and close the diaphragm. You can see that the diaphragm is in fine shape here. It is pretty far down inside the lens to clean here, but you can submerge the back half of this lens without any problem in some sort of cleaning solution. Just work the blades back and forth, and that should work pretty well in most cases. Also on the back of the diaphragm, there's this little lever over here, and that kind of springs back and forth. And this one's going to couple into the gray sheet as well. So normally when I move this black lever back and forth, nothing happens. So it's not stopping down the lens or anything. But when you press in this little lever here, then it engages the aperture, and moving this back and forth opens and closes the diaphragm. So with that, the disassembly of this lens is pretty much all complete besides the diaphragm. We have the optics here, various optical pieces, separate from all the various body rings like focusing ring, depth of field scale ring, separate from the mechanical sections. It's actually a very simple mechanical setup inside the lens. It's just because it's a telephoto lens, it has some longer pieces that are coupling everything together. So during the reassembly, we'll have to take that into consideration. So starting on the reassembly here, the first thing we're going to do is get the focusing mechanism back together. This is probably the hardest part of the reassembly. You can try taking this part apart and then putting these rings back together separately, but I don't think that makes it any easier. It might even be harder. So I think it's easier in this case to just put this all back together in a single step. You'll notice on this part of the focusing mechanism here, there are these two bars. You can actually detach these. They're little screws on the silver section here. But these bars are going into the grooves in here so that the inner part of the focusing mechanism goes up and down instead of rotating about. So this is just going to screw onto the focusing mechanism down here, but we also have to line up the bars correctly. So first off, I'm going to make sure that on this piece here, there's a small gap between these two. So you notice when I rotate the black one around, the black ring around, it kind of increases this gap in here. I want to make sure there's a small gap, but the threads are not really visible right here. Then I'm going to thread this on top of the other piece, pressing back the little levers and things on this side and going around those. And on this section here, I want to line it up so that I can see the little bars through here so that that lines up properly, and then thread, holding the silver ring in place at that stage, thread the black ring back into its position, which can be a little bit difficult sometimes. All right, so once you get that together successfully, it should screw together fully. And if you go up to the top, it should focus up to the top here and kind of stop, and then you can focus down. And if you focus too far in that other direction right now, it will still go off the end of the track, so just be careful for now. But we'll reinstall the little stopper thing at this stage as well. So this little bar is going to go right here in the two screw holes there. And this prevents you from focusing back out and removing that, removing the inner part of the focusing mechanism from the focusing entirely. Next up, we'll install some of the various coupling components on the back section here. So we have this piece, which is actually what's coupling the aperture control ring in. So the aperture control ring is controlling this little lever over here. So it's pushing up and down on this post in the lever, and it's controlling that through the aperture control curve on this piece right here. So this little post is going to go in this curve and move up and down along that curve. So this piece just sits right on top of it. Make sure that the post is going into the curve there. Should rotate smoothly back and forth. And then to hold that in place is the little silver retaining ring which goes on top. And that just holds it in place. And while we're here, we may as well install the back optic as well. So looking at the back optic, it has kind of a concave side over here and then the convex side over here. It's a little bit hard to see on this, but the concave side is the one that goes towards the back of the lens on this. So just reinstall this. There is a little stopper ring or spacing ring down here as well, which we didn't remove before, but that may fall out when you're taking apart the lens originally. Just make sure that that's in place, and then reinstall the back optic here. And we'll lock it in place using this black tube. Now we'll start installing some of the body sections again. So first off, we have this ring here with the depth of field scale on it. So it's going to slide over the lens like this, but we have to line up a few things for this to happen correctly. So in here, in this piece on the back side here, you can see that there's a larger gap over here. That's what this fork is going through. And we can kind of lock this piece down in any orientation. It's just using these little set screws. But you have to make sure that when we do lock this piece down, that the fork can move through its entire range and isn't getting stopped anywhere. So I'm going to line this up to get the fork going through that piece roughly. And you can kind of see that there are little indentations where the screws were going before. So that might be a good guide to line this up to start. And looking here at the back, what I want to look for is that in this curve over here, which is the aperture control curve and is coupled to this fork, I can move back and forth through the entire range. So I should be able to go from either extreme of that curve, and it looks like I'm pretty good right now. So I'll just lock this down using the 5 little set screws going around here. So next up here, we'll start installing some of the other body sections. You have the aperture control ring here, and this is going to get coupled into that little curve through this slot over here. So let me adjust that over a little. So it's going to go into the curve by hooking in with a little screw into the fork right there, and that's how it's going to couple in as it rotates back and forth. So let me get this fork over a little bit. And to get this lined up properly, what makes the clicking sound as well is the little ball bearing, which is going right under the indicator here. So I'll get the ball bearing in place first, and then just lower the aperture control curve onto that right there. And then looking in at the inside of the lens, I'm going to take the screw here and thread it in so it goes through the fork on the inside. You can kind of see it down there. Make sure it's going through the fork. Okay, so that looks good. Now just tighten this down. So this should rotate back and forth through its entire range with the fork. Entire range of the aperture control curve. If it's not, then you probably reattach the ring here incorrectly. And that would, you can just spin it around a little bit until it does rotate through the entire range. We'll reinstall this little stopper thing here as well. I think it just limits how far you can turn the aperture control ring. I'm not sure of its entire function, but it goes, little silver peg goes right there. Now we have the next silver ring here, which goes on top of the aperture control ring, and this is the one that switches between the two modes of this lens. So it has a little, let me find where the indicator is. So there's a little red dot on it somewhere, and that's going to go over by the indicator here. Then it also has a ball bearing that goes over by the indicator in that little pocket as well, so get that in place. And then find the red dot and line that up correctly and just slide it in place. Actually, other way here. And it should have a position where it kind of snaps in place, and then you can rotate it freely in the other directions for now. And then we'll complete that by installing the little screw that goes in there. This is going to couple in the control of this into the lever on this side. So it's actually controlling the behavior of the stop-down lever, which we'll install in a moment. Stop-down lever and the back of the mounting plate, part of it at least, it has this long thing that's going to hit up against part of the inside of the plate here. So right now, you can kind of see down inside the lens, we have the aperture control ring controlling that little lever in there on the diaphragm before. And then we have those other levers and sets of levers over here. And what the aperture control or the stop-down lever is going to actually do is hit up against the larger lever on this side, actually stop things down. And then by moving the control ring back and forth with this stop-down lever going through here, you can either hit it all the way open or actually control the behavior of it. So just have to make sure that this one goes over to this side of that little black lever over there. So we'll thread it through and get it started. And then the screw holes on the back should line up as well. And when you hit the lever here, it should stop down properly. And this one was getting held in place by the mounting plate. So we'll take the mounting plate. It does have a little red indicator on it, which should line up with the other indicators over here. And that one specifically uses the weird kind of screw that doesn't really have it's not a slotted screw, it's not a Phillips head screw, it's just kind of odd. So that one's a little bit harder to put back in place, but we'll reattach this. Test out the lens here, make sure that it's working properly at this point. So actually going in, going between the two modes here allows you to directly control the aperture or not. So I'll just set it to manual for the moment. And in manual mode, you can directly control the aperture with the aperture control ring. And then in auto mode, hitting the stop down lever will, normally turning the aperture control ring does nothing. And then hitting the stop down lever stops it all the way down. And after reassembling it to this stage, if your lens is not actually properly, the diaphragm is not being properly controlled, like it's still visible or something when it's at 3.5, then you can actually adjust how the diaphragm is being controlled by rotating this entire back section around by undoing these 5 screws, just slightly rotating it in either direction, seeing how that works, and then tightening it back down. And that allows you to adjust how the diaphragm is being controlled and make some finer adjustments to that. So now we'll start assembling the front of the lens. And on the front of the lens here, start with the focusing ring here. So we have the focusing ring, and because we took off the focusing ring, normally we would have to zero this back to infinity. So you would install the focusing ring here and then install the optics. But I'll just describe how you would zero it to infinity after I reattach the focusing ring here. So the focusing ring is held in place by the 3 little screws way down there. They're a little bit hard to actually reattach because they're recessed so far down inside the lens. All right, so that's got the focusing mechanism just reattached temporarily, and we'll zero it in a moment. So now we'll reinstall the optics of the lens. First off, big main element here just drops into place. And then this little spacer ring goes on top of it. And then the top element goes on top of that. And we lock all those down with this black ring. Now the entire lens is optically reassembled, and this is the stage where you would actually zero the lens. So you would take it, mount it on a camera, and at this stage, you don't know if when it's actually indicating infinity over here, if it's optically focused at infinity. So you'd rotate this back and forth and find where it is actually optically focused at infinity. And maybe even here, it's focused at like 30 meters or something and not actually at infinity. So what you would do then is loosen up the 3 screws down here in the focusing ring, and spin it around, or spin these screws around, or tighten it back down somewhere and just spin this ring around until you can get it focused to infinity. Once you have it focused over at infinity, then you would loosen up these screws again and spin the ring around, just the focusing ring, not optically focusing the lens here. You would spin just the focusing ring around until it indicates infinity, and that would line things up so that when it's indicating infinity, it's optically focused at infinity as well. So to complete the reassembly of this front section, finally we have the front filter ring here, just screws in place on top of everything, and then the name ring just locking everything down. So that has the reassembly of the lens complete. You can check and make sure that things are working properly, that the various aperture control things over here work properly, so that when you're in manual mode, the aperture control ring directly controls the aperture here. And then when you're in auto mode, hitting the stop down lever stops down the aperture properly. And you can also check and make sure that the focusing is working as expected, and that if you zeroed the lens, it's focusing correctly back to infinity. Overall, I would say that this lens is not too hard to take apart, but there are definitely some annoyances. It's harder to take apart than the comparable 135mm f3.5 Minolta lens, in that lens had a slightly simpler setup and fewer components. But this lens is very solidly built. It uses all metal components. And the way things are working internally mechanically is very simple. I wasn't able to find a way to take apart the diaphragm fully, but if there's just a small amount of grime on the diaphragm, it's usually best to just clean it in its current housing and not worry about reassembling the diaphragm and having to worry about breaking or damaging all the little blades. So it's a repairable lens with a few minor annoyances.